They called her the poor Guggenheim, the embarrassing one, the family member no one quite knew what to do with. She spent decades buying art that the serious collectors of her time dismissed as worthless. When she died in 1979, that art was worth more than $3 billion, and almost nobody saw it coming. To understand how Peggy Guggenheim ended up where she did, you have to understand where she started. And where she started was inside one of the most powerful families in the United States, but on the wrong side of it. The Guggenheim fortune was built by a man named Meyer Guggenheim, a Jewish immigrant from the Swiss town of Lengnau who arrived in the United States in 1847 with almost nothing. He peddled household goods in Philadelphia for years, sold stove polish and spices, and slowly, methodically, accumulated enough capital to take a risk. In 1881, he accepted a half interest in 2 silver mines in Leadville, Colorado as payment for a debt. He did not particularly want them. But those mines struck rich, and within a few years they were producing hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Meyer realized that the real money was not in pulling ore out of the ground, but in smelting it, refining it, controlling the process from earth to market. He built a smelter in Pueblo, Colorado, then another, then more. He brought his 7 sons into the business, organized them under the name M. Guggenheim's Sons, and together they built an empire that came to dominate the American mining and smelting industry. By the turn of the century, Guggen controlled copper, silver, lead, and diamond operations stretching from Colorado to Mexico to Alaska to the Congo. The family's combined wealth was estimated at somewhere in the range of $250 to $300 million. In early 20th century terms, that was not simply rich. That was a dynasty. Benjamin Guggenheim, the 5th of those 7 sons, was the one who did not fit. He had entered Columbia College in 1882, found most of his courses dull, and dropped out after 2 years. He lacked his father's instinct for business, and he lacked the grinding patience that the mining world demanded. In 1910, he made a decision that would echo through the rest of his family story. He terminated his partnership with his brothers and struck out on his own, giving up his share of the family enterprise to pursue independent ventures. Those ventures did not go well. His investments were poor, his judgment unreliable, and his fortune shrank steadily. He maintained an extravagant lifestyle regardless, keeping homes in New York and Paris, and spending long stretches in Europe, often in the company of women who were not his wife. His wife was Florette Seligman, the daughter of James Seligman, a senior partner in the banking firm J. and W. Seligman and Company. The Seligmans were old German Jewish money, established in the United States a full decade before the Guggenheims arrived, and they carried the particular confidence of a family that considered itself socially superior. Florette had married beneath her expectations, and by most accounts she knew it. The marriage was unhappy almost from the beginning. Benjamin was absent. Florette was eccentric in ways that her children found bewildering and sometimes distressing, prone to repeating phrases compulsively, fixated on hygiene to an extreme degree, and emotionally unavailable in the way that deeply unhappy people sometimes are when they have turned all of their energy inward. Into this household, 3 daughters were born: Benita in 1895, Marguerite, called Peggy, and Barbara Hazel in 1903. They grew up on the Upper East Side of Manhattan in a house that was, by any external measure, magnificent. Crystal chandeliers in the dollhouse, private tutors instead of school, summers in Europe. But Peggy would later describe her childhood as one long protracted agony and claim she had no pleasant memories of any kind. That was perhaps an exaggeration sharpened by years of retrospect, but the emotional landscape of that household was genuinely bleak. A father who was rarely there, a mother who was present but unreachable. And the constant awareness, even as a child, that within the wider Guggenheim world, their branch of the family was the one people talked about with a slight shake of the head. Then the Titanic sank. On April 10, 1912, Benjamin Guggenheim boarded the ship at Cherbourg, France. He was traveling with his French mistress, a singer named Leontine Aubard, along with his valet, Victor Giglio, and his chauffeur, René Pernot. When the ship struck the iceberg on the night of April 14th, Benjamin and Giglio helped women and children into lifeboats. They declined seats for themselves. And then they did something that became one of the most famous stories of the disaster. They returned to their first-class cabin, removed their life preservers, and changed into formal evening wear. White tie, tails. Benjamin reportedly told a steward, "We have dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." He asked another steward to deliver a message to Florette. "If anything should happen to me, tell my wife in New York that I have done my best in doing my duty." The last anyone saw of Benjamin Guggenheim and Victor Giglio, They were seated in deck chairs near the grand staircase, sipping brandy, smoking cigars, and waiting for the water to come. Peggy was 13 years old. Her father's body was never recovered, and the fortune he left behind was, by Guggenheim standards, modest. His 3 daughters each received a trust fund of roughly $450,000. When Peggy came of age in 1919, she inherited approximately $2.5 million in total. That sounds like a great deal of money, and in absolute terms it was. But her accountant later calculated that if Benjamin had stayed in the family partnership instead of leaving it, Peggy would have inherited closer to $200 million. Her cousins, the children of the brothers who had remained in the business, lived on an entirely different financial plane. They had mansions and foundations and museums being built in their names. Peggy had enough to live comfortably. She did not have enough to be taken seriously as a Guggenheim. And that gap, that specific distance between who she was supposed to be and what she actually had, became the engine of everything that followed. It made her hungry in a way that true wealth never does. It gave her something to prove. And it sent her, at 21 years old, looking for a world that would let her become someone other than the poor Guggenheim daughter with the dead father and the difficult nose and the mother who repeated everything 3 times. She found that world in Paris, and it changed everything. Before she left, she tried to fix her nose. That detail matters more than it might seem, because it tells you something essential about where Peggy Guggenheim was, emotionally, at the moment she decided to blow up her life. She was 22 years old. She had inherited her trust. She had money, not Guggenheim money, but enough. And the thing she chose to do with her first taste of independence was to go to a surgeon in Cincinnati and ask him to make her look like someone other than who she was. Her sisters were considered beauties. Peggy was not. She had inherited what she called the Guggenheim nose, and it had become, in her own mind, the physical proof of everything she believed was wrong with her. The surgeon began the procedure and stopped partway through, deciding the operation was too difficult to finish. Peggy was left with a nose that looked worse than before. She spent 2 months hiding from everyone she knew. And then she did something that would define the rest of her life. She decided to stop trying to be the thing her world expected and to go find a world that would take her as she was. But first, there was the bookstore. In 1920, Peggy took a job at the Sunwise Turn, a small avant-garde bookshop near Grand Central Station in Manhattan. It was not the kind of place a Guggenheim was expected to work. It was run by a woman named Madge Jennison, and it functioned less as a retail operation than as a gathering point for writers, artists, and intellectuals who were pushing against the edges of what American culture was willing to accept. F. Scott Fitzgerald came through, Theodore Dreiser, John Dos Passos. The photographer Alfred Stieglitz was a regular presence. And it was at the Sunwise Turn that Peggy held a modern painting in her hands for the first time, an abstract work by Georgia O'Keeffe that Stieglitz showed her. She did not yet know what she was looking at. She did not yet have the vocabulary for it, but something registered, something opened. In 1920, Petzischwi sailed for Paris. She was 23, unmarried, unattached, carrying her inheritance and a hunger for something she could not yet name. And Paris in the early 1920s was exactly the right place to be hungry. The city was electric with the aftermath of the First World War, full of American and British expatriates who had come to Europe because it was cheaper, freer, and less interested in the rules that governed polite society back home. Writers sat in cafes arguing about the future of the novel. Painters were tearing apart every assumption about what art was supposed to look like. The Dada movement was in full swing, an organized assault on reason and tradition that resonated with anyone who had watched the old world send an entire generation into the trenches for nothing. Peggy fell into this world completely. She moved through the expatriate circles of Montparnasse with a combination of genuine curiosity and social recklessness that made people notice her. She was not beautiful, and she knew it, and she compensated by being direct, provocative, and fearless in a way that most women of her background would not have dared. She met the photographer Man Ray. She met the designer Mina Loy. She met Marcel Duchamp, the artist who had submitted a urinal to an art exhibition in 1917 and called it a fountain, and changed the terms of what art could be. Duchamp would become one of the most important figures in her life, not as a lover, though that came briefly later, but as a guide. He was the person who would eventually teach her how to see. But the man she noticed first was Lawrence Vail. He was American, blonde, handsome, and known in the Paris expatriate world as the King of Bohemia. He was a writer and sculptor who never wore a hat, and who moved through the streets with a kind of chaotic freedom that Peggy had never encountered in anyone from her world. She later wrote that he appeared to her like someone from another planet. She was shocked by his freedom, she said, but fascinated at the same time. They married in March of 1922. What followed was both exhilarating and terrible, often at the same time. Through Vale, Peggy gained full access to the artistic and literary circles of 1920s Paris. She met Juna Barnes, the novelist. She befriended the anarchist Emma Goldman, who was living in the south of France in exile, disillusioned and struggling to write her memoirs. Peggy gave Goldman a house and a monthly allowance. She gave money to Mina Loy to open a lamp shop. She gave money to writers who could not pay their rent. She discovered early on that her money, even though it was not enough to impress her own family, was more than enough to sustain an entire community of artists who had none. The marriage gave her 2 children, a son, Michael Cedric Sindbad, born in 1923, and a daughter, Pegine, born in Switzerland in 1925. But the marriage also gave her something else. Lawrence Vale drank heavily and had a violent temper that expressed itself in ways that went well beyond raised voices. He threw her possessions. He set things on fire. He threw her down a flight of stairs. In one incident in Saint-Tropez, he tried to tear her clothes off in a public restaurant, and it took another man to physically pull him away. Peggy's friend Emma Goldman pulled her aside more than once and asked how she could endure it. The answer for a time was that she endured it because Vale was the door through which she had entered the only world that had ever made sense to her. Without him, she was a rich American tourist. With him, she was inside the conversation. But the cost was real and it was accumulating. In 1920, while visiting Goldman in the south of France, Peggy met a British writer named John Holmes. He kissed her in a tower. And that, as she later put it, was the end of one life and the beginning of another. She left Vale. The divorce was not finalized until 1930, but the marriage was over the moment she walked out. They remained, remarkably, on friendly terms for the rest of their lives. Peggy was 30 years old. She had 2 small children, a diminished inheritance, a badly repaired nose, and a growing certainty that the world of art and artists was the only place she had ever felt truly alive. She had escaped the Upper East Side, escaped the expectations of her family, escaped as role she had been assigned at birth. But she had not yet found the thing that would make the escape mean something. That was still coming. And it would arrive, as these things often do, through a combination of grief, accident, and the quiet influence of people who could see things she had not yet learned to see. After Lawrence Vale, there was John Holmes. And you have to understand what John Holmes meant to Peggy to understand what happened after he was gone. Holmes was British, a writer, though he had written almost nothing. He was tall, handsome, and possessed of a mind that Peggy later described as the most extraordinary she had ever encountered. Everyone who knew him said some version of the same thing, that he was brilliant, that his conversation was unlike anyone else's, that he could hold an entire room still with the quality of his thinking, and that he could not, for reasons no one fully understood, put any of it on paper. He was also an alcoholic. That fact sat beneath everything else and eventually consumed it. Peggy and Holmes spent years traveling together across Europe, moving through at least 20 countries by her count, living the kind of rootless, intense expatriate life that was still possible in the early 1930s for people with money and no fixed obligations. She called him the love of her life, and she meant it in a way she never quite meant it about anyone else. Holmes was the man who made her feel intellectually alive rather than merely tolerated. He treated her mind as something worth engaging with, which was not something every man in her life had done. In the summer of 1933, Holmes fractured his wrist while riding with Peggy on Dartmoor. The bones did not set properly. Doctors recommended a simple surgical procedure to realign them. On the morning of January 19, 1934, Holmes went under anesthetic for the operation. He had been drinking heavily the night before, and his body, weakened by years of excess, could not sustain the shock. He died on the table. He was in his early 40s. Peggy was 35. The grief was enormous. She later wrote that after his death she lived in perpetual terror of losing her soul. That language tells you something about the scale of what she felt. This was not simply the loss of a partner. It was the loss of the person who had for a few years made the world feel intelligible to her. What followed was a period of retreat. Peggy moved in with Douglas Garman, an English publisher and political activist she had met through Holmes the year before. They settled into Yew Tree Cottage, a small house in the Hampshire countryside near Petersfield, and for a time Peggy lived the most domestic life she had ever known. She looked after her daughter Pegine. She walked the downs. She wrote letters to friends in which she described herself as bored and lonely. Garman became increasingly absorbed in communist politics, joining the Communist Party of Great Britain and spending his time lecturing and organizing rather than being present with her. The relationship drifted. It did not end with a dramatic rupture. It simply emptied itself of whatever had held it together. By 1937, Peggy was 39 years old. She had been in Europe for nearly 2 decades. She had married, divorced, loved, lost, raised 2 children in a series of temporary homes across France and England, and spent most of her inheritance sustaining a community of artists and writers who could not sustain themselves. And she still had no idea what she was going to do with her life. That year, 2 things happened that changed everything. The first was the death of her mother, Florette, who died in New York and left Peggy an additional inheritance, variously reported as somewhere around $450,000 to $500,000 in trust. It was not transformative wealth by Guggenheim standards, but it was enough to do something with. The second was a conversation. A friend suggested to Peggy that she needed to do some serious work. The word serious landed. It stayed. And then there was Samuel Beckett. Peggy met Beckett in Paris around Christmas of 1937. He was not yet the Samuel Beckett the world would later know, not yet the Nobel laureate, not yet the author of Waiting for Godot. He was a young Irish writer living in Paris, quiet, intense, deeply private, and working through the early stages of a literary career that had not yet found its audience. He and Peggy fell into a brief, intense affair. By most accounts, it lasted only about 12 days, though its influence extended far beyond that. It was Beckett who told Peggy something she had not heard before, or had not been ready to hear. He urged her to dedicate herself to contemporary art. Not art as decoration, not art as a social activity. Contemporary art, he said, because it was a living thing. That phrase mattered. It drew a line between the old masters Peggy had admired in a general, untrained way and the art that was being made around her by people she knew in rooms she had been sitting in for years without fully understanding what was happening in them. Beckett gave her the idea, but the man who gave her the education was Marcel Duchamp. Duchamp had been in Peggy's orbit since the early 1920s, since her first years in Paris with Laurence Vail. He was one of the most radical artists of the 20th century, the man who had placed a urinal in a gallery in 1917 and called it Fountain, the man who had challenged every assumption about what art was, what it could be, and who got to decide. He was also by temperament a teacher. He enjoyed explaining things. And in Peggy, he found a student who was genuinely willing to learn, not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because she had finally realized that this was the thing she had been circling for her entire adult life, without ever quite landing on it. Duchamp taught her, as she later put it, the difference between abstract and surrealist art. That sounds like a simple distinction, and in academic terms it is. But for Peggy, it was the beginning of a language. He took her to studios. He introduced her to artists. He explained what they were doing and why it mattered and how to look at a painting not as a decorative object, but as an argument, a proposition, a way of seeing the world that did not exist before someone made it visible on canvas. He did not do this once. He did it over years, patiently, consistently, with the kind of generosity that only someone who genuinely cares about the thing they are teaching can sustain. By the end of 1907, Peggy Guggenheim was no longer a wealthy bohemian drifting through the European art world on the margins. She was a woman with a purpose. And the purpose, once she found it, turned out to be the thing she had been built for all along, even if it took her nearly 4 decades to see it. She was going to open a gallery. She was going to show the art that the established world did not yet take seriously. And she was going to do it not because she was a Guggenheim, but because she had finally learned how to see. On January 24, 1938, Peggy Guggenheim opened a gallery at 30 Cork Street in the Mayfair district of London. She was 39 years old. She had no formal training in art history. She had no experience running a business of any kind. She had Marcel Duchamp's guidance, a modest amount of money, and the particular kind of courage that belongs to people who have spent a long time being underestimated and have decided they no longer care. The gallery was above a pawn shop. She called it Guggenheim Jeune, a deliberate play on the name of the Bernheim Jeune Gallery in Paris, one of the most prestigious art dealers in Europe. The cheekiness of the name was intentional. It announced to anyone who was paying attention that this was a Guggenheim who was not going to be quiet about it, but who was also not going to pretend she was something she was not. The Jeune was a wink. The Guggenheim was a declaration. Duchamp organized the opening exhibition. It was a show of drawings by Jean Cocteau, the French poet, filmmaker, and artist, who was one of the most versatile creative figures in Europe. And it nearly did not happen. Among the works Cocteau sent to London were 2 large drawings on linen sheets depicting naked figures whose genitals were covered by fig leaves but whose pubic hair remained visible. British customs officers intercepted the works at Croydon Airport and detained them, declaring them too obscene for public display. Peggy and Duchamp had to race to the airport and negotiate their release. The customs officials eventually relented on the condition that the offending drawings would be shown in a back room rather than the main gallery. Peggy agreed. The show opened. London had its first look at what Guggenheim Gene was going to be. And what it was going to be, it turned out, was unlike anything London had seen before. The city's art establishment in the late 1930s was deeply conservative. The Royal Academy dominated taste. The Tate Gallery, under its director at the time, had recently declared for customs purposes that sculptures by Alexander Calder, Jeanne Arp, and Antoine Pevsner, which Guggenheim Jeune was importing for a later exhibition, were not works of art at all. That was the world Peggy was operating in. A world in which the official custodians of British culture looked at the work of some of the most important sculptors of the 20th century and said, quite seriously, that what they had made did not qualify as art. Peggy did not argue with them publicly. She simply kept showing the work. In February 1938, 1 month after the Cocteau opening, she mounted the first solo exhibition of Wassily Kandinsky's paintings ever held in Britain. Kandinsky was already in his 70s, already recognized across continental Europe as one of the founders of abstract art, and he had never had a solo show in London. Peggy gave him one. She also bought a painting from the exhibition, a practice she would continue throughout the life of the gallery, purchasing at least one work from nearly every show she mounted. The Kandinsky exhibition was followed by a solo show for the French surrealist Yves Tanguy, which was also a first for Britain. Tanguy came to London with his wife to help hang the exhibition, and during the process he and Peggy fell into an affair that was brief, intense, and characteristic of the way Peggy moved through the world. Her personal and professional lives were not separate territories. They overlapped constantly, sometimes productively, sometimes chaotically, always in ways that gave the people around her something to talk about. The Tanguy show was a critical and commercial success, the only one the gallery would have. Peggy later wrote that Tanguy found himself rich for the first time in his life because of the sales. Over the next 18 months, Guggenheim Jeune mounted more than 20 exhibitions. It showed work by Arp, by Brancusi, by Calder, by Kurt Schwitters. It organized the first exhibition of collage ever held in Britain. It mounted a contemporary sculpture show that became a national controversy, precisely because the kind of sculpture Peggy was showing bore no resemblance to what the British public expected sculpture to look like. There was even a children's art exhibition that included a drawing by a young boy named Lucien Freud, who was 8 years old at the time and who would grow up to become one of the most important figurative painters of the 20th century. Whether Peggy noticed the drawing or not is unrecorded, but it was there on her walls years before anyone knew what it would come to represent. The gallery did not make money. It lost money consistently, and Peggy found that selling modern art in a city that was not ready for it was a fundamentally different proposition from showing it. But something else was happening that mattered more than the accounts. Peggy was learning. She was learning how to look at art not as a spectator but as someone whose choices had consequences, whose decisions about what to show and what to buy and what to champion would shape what other people saw and understood. She was developing a curatorial instinct that was genuinely her own, not Duchamp's taste, not Herbert Reed's scholarship, but her own sense of what was alive and what was important and what deserved to be seen. By mid-1939, she had arrived at a conclusion. The gallery was not enough. What she actually wanted was a museum of modern art in London, something that did not yet exist and that the city desperately needed. She enlisted Herbert Reed, the leading art critic in Britain, to serve as its director. Reed was serious, respected, and deeply knowledgeable. Together they began drawing up plans. Reed compiled a list of every artist who should be represented in the museum's collection, a kind of master document of 20th century modernism, organized by movement and by significance. It was ambitious, comprehensive, and, as it turned out, spectacularly well-timed, though not in the way either of them intended, because the museum never happened. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the war that everyone had been watching approach for years finally arrived. London was about to become a city under bombardment. A museum of modern art was no longer a plausible undertaking. Guggenheim Jeune closed its doors for the last time. The dream of a London museum evaporated, but Reed's list survived. And Peggy, rather than abandoning the project entirely, did something that would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions in the history of 20th century art collecting. She took the list to Paris. And she decided that if she could not build a museum, she would build a collection. She would buy the art herself, all of it if she could, one painting a day if that was what it took. And she would do it while the world around her was falling apart, because the art that was being made in that moment by those people in those rooms was a living thing. And living things, she understood by now, are the ones most at risk of being lost. In August 1939, Peggy Guggenheim arrived in Paris with Herbert Reed's list in her pocket and a plan to acquire the foundation of a museum. 2 weeks later, Germany invaded Poland. The museum was finished before it started, but the list survived. And Peggy, rather than retreating, did something that looked from the outside like recklessness and from the inside like the clearest decision she had ever made. She stayed, and she started buying. She put herself on a regime. One painting a day, that was the goal. And in the Paris of 1939 and 1940, it was achievable in a way it would never have been at any other moment in history, because the art market in the city was collapsing. Artists who had been holding their work for years were now desperate to sell. Jewish dealers were trying to liquidate their inventories before the situation got worse. Galleries were closing, people were leaving. And the prices of modern art, which had never been high to begin with for the avant-garde work Peggy was interested in, fell to levels that are almost impossible to believe when you look at them now. She bought a Piet Mondrian composition for around $160. She bought a René Magritte for $75. She bought works by Georges Braque, by Salvador Dali, by Joan Miro, by Paul Klee, by Marc Chagall, by Man Ray. She bought Fernand Leger's Men in the city on the same day that Hitler invaded Norway. Leger himself was reportedly astonished by her composure. The German army was advancing across Scandinavia, and this American woman was in his studio, calmly negotiating a price for a painting. She patrolled the ateliers of Paris with Reed's list in one hand and her checkbook in the other, moving from studio to studio, snapping up works that the established art world had not yet decided to value and that the war was threatening to destroy. And then there was Brancusi. Constantin Brancusi, the Romanian sculptor, was one of the most important artists of the century, and Peggy had wanted his bird in space for a long time. She visited his studio repeatedly. She later admitted, with the candor that made some people love her and others cringe, that she had considered having an affair with him in the hope that it might lower the price. Whether that calculation played any role in what happened between them is not entirely clear. What is clear is that she bought the piece. And when she came to collect it, Brancusi carried the sculpture out in his arms with tears streaming down his face. She never knew, she said later, whether he was crying because he was losing her or because he was losing his favorite bird. By the spring of 1940, Peggy had assembled the core of what would become one of the most important private art collections of the 20th century. Works by Picasso, Kandinsky, Mondrian, Dali, Braque, Leger, Klee, Ernst, Giacometti, Arp, Brancusi, and dozens of others. She had spent a fraction of what these works would later be worth. She had bought them in a city that was about to fall. And now she had to get them out. She tried the Louvre first. She asked the museum to store her collection for safekeeping away from the bombs that were already hitting the outskirts of the city. The Louvre refused. The works, they said, were too modern to be worth saving. That sentence is worth sitting with for a moment. The National Museum of France looked at paintings by Picasso, Kandinsky, and Mondrian and said they were not worth protecting. Peggy later took a certain bitter pleasure in retelling this story. She understood what it meant. The art she had collected was so far ahead of the institutions that were supposed to be the arbiters of cultural value that those institutions could not even recognize it as art. The solution came from Duchamp. He suggested that the collection be packed among Peggy's personal belongings, labeled as household goods, and shipped across the Atlantic as ordinary cargo. The paintings were wrapped in linens and blankets, stored in a barn outside Paris to a friend, and eventually sent to New York, disguised as the unremarkable possessions of an American woman going home. It was an act of smuggling carried out in plain sight, and it worked. But the art was only part of what needed saving. The artists themselves were in danger. Many of them were Jewish, or politically suspect, or both. The Nazi regime had declared their work degenerate. Staying in occupied France meant imprisonment at best and death at worst. In Marseille, an American journalist named Varian Fry had established the Emergency Rescue Committee, an operation dedicated to getting endangered intellectuals and artists out of the country. Fry was operating in the gray space between legality and resistance, arranging visas, forging documents, and finding passage on ships for people whose lives depended on leaving Europe. Peggy became one of Fry's most important financial supporters. She funded the escape of André Breton and his family. She helped pay for the passage of Marc Chagall. She supported Jacques Lipschitz, André Masson, and others. And in the chaotic, desperate atmosphere of wartime Marseille, she met Max Ernst. Ernst was German, a surrealist painter of enormous reputation, and he had been imprisoned twice by the French authorities as an enemy alien before managing to reach Marseille and the protection of Fry's network. He was brilliant, handsome, emotionally remote, and accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. He and Peggy fell into an affair almost immediately. The way she told it later was characteristically direct. He asked her when and where they should meet. She said tomorrow, 4 o'clock, at the Café de la Paix, and you know why. In the summer of 1941, the group that left Marseille for New York was one of the most improbable traveling parties in the history of transatlantic migration. Peggy, her ex-husband Lawrence Vail, Vail's current wife Max Ernst, Peggy's 2 children, Vail's children, and the accumulated baggage of several disrupted lives, all bound for a country that most of them had not seen in years. Peggy, who was Jewish, had spent her final weeks in France being questioned by Vichy authorities. She survived those interrogations by insisting she was Meltronen and refusing to acknowledge her religion. It was closer to real danger than she had ever been. They arrived in New York in July 1941. Peggy married Max Ernst in December of that year. It was her second marriage, and like the first, it was built on a foundation of genuine attraction and fundamental incompatibility. Ernst was cold where Peggy was reckless. He was self-contained where she was needy. He resented being dependent on her money, and she resented being made to feel that her money was the only interesting thing about her. The marriage would not last. But by the time it ended, Peggy would have done something far more important than marry a famous painter. She would have opened the gallery that changed the course of American art. On the evening of October 20th, 1942, Peggy Guggenheim opened the doors of Art of the Century at 30 West 57th Street in Manhattan. She wore 1 Tanguy earring and 1 Calder earring, one on each side, to show what she called her impartiality between surrealist and abstract art. It was a small gesture, but it told you everything about what the gallery was going to be. This was not a place that intended to choose sides, it intended to show the whole field. The space itself was unlike anything New York had ever seen. Peggy had hired the Austrian architect Friedrich Kiesler to transform 2 former tailor shops on the 7th floor into something that did not resemble a gallery at all. Kiesler built curved walls. He suspended paintings on wires and mounted them on thin wooden projections so that they appeared to float in mid-air, unframed, untethered from the architecture around them. He created separate rooms, an abstract gallery, a surrealist gallery, a kinetic gallery with mechanical viewing devices, and a daylight gallery for temporary exhibitions. The lighting shifted. The walls curved. The furniture Kiesler designed could serve simultaneously as a bench, a table, or a sculpture pedestal. The entire environment was built to make people feel that they were not simply looking at art but moving through it, that the art was alive, and so was the space that held it. The press release for the opening announced that the gallery would be a research laboratory for new ideas, a space that would serve the future instead of recording the past. And that is exactly what it became. But not in the way Peggy initially expected. The gallery opened with her European collection, the masterpieces she had smuggled out of France as household goods. Picasso, Braque, Mondrian, Kandinsky, Dali, Ernst, Miro, Léger, Brancusi. These were the names that drew people through the door. But almost immediately, something else began to happen. Young American painters who had been working in obscurity, struggling to find gallery space, struggling to find anyone who would take their work seriously, began showing up at Art of this Century. And Peggy, guided by her assistant Howard Putzel, a man with an extraordinary eye for emerging talent, began to notice them. In the spring of 1903, Peggy organized a salon exhibition for young artists. One of the jurors was Piet Mondrian, the Dutch abstractionist whose own work Peggy had bought in Paris for $160. Among the paintings submitted was a canvas by a 31-year-old painter named Jackson Pollock. Pollock was virtually unknown. He had spent years studying under the muralist Thomas Hart Benton, had worked on the Federal Art Project during the Depression, and had most recently been employed as a janitor and handyman at the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, which was, with considerable irony, the institution founded by Peggy's uncle Solomon. He was broke. He was an alcoholic. He was struggling with depression and creative paralysis, and the painting he submitted to the Salon stopped Mondrian in his tracks. Mondrian told Peggy that he believed he was looking at the most exciting art he had seen so far in America. That endorsement from one of the most respected living painters in the world changed everything. Peggy signed Pollock to a contract. She paid him a monthly stipend of $150, enough to allow him to quit his maintenance job and paint full-time. She gave him his first solo exhibition at Art of this Century in November 1943. And she commissioned him to paint a mural for the entrance hall of her townhouse on East 61st Street. The mural became one of the foundational stories of American art. Duchamp suggested it be painted on canvas rather than directly on the wall, so it could be moved. Peggy bought an enormous piece of Belgian linen, nearly 20 feet long, and gave it to Pollock with no instructions beyond the size. He stared at the blank canvas for months. He told friends he was completely blocked. Peggy, growing impatient, told him he needed to finish it or she would cut off his stipend. The legend that grew up around what happened next, that he painted the entire mural in a single night of furious, uninterrupted work, is almost certainly an exaggeration. Later conservation analysis showed that the painting was built up over weeks in multiple layers. But the legend mattered as much as the reality, because the story of Pollock was always partly about the myth of the artist as a force of nature, and Peggy was the person who gave that myth its first stage. When the critic Clement Greenberg saw the finished mural in Peggy's hallway, he said he took one look and knew that Jackson Pollock was the greatest painter the country had ever produced. That was hyperbole, perhaps. But Greenberg was the most influential art critic in America, and his endorsement, combined with Peggy's patronage, launched Pollock into a trajectory that would eventually make him the most famous American artist of the 20th century. And Pollock was not the only one. Over the 5 years that Art of this Century operated, Peggy gave first solo exhibitions to Robert Motherwell, to William Basiotis, to Clifford Still, to Mark Rothko, to Hans Hofmann. She showed the work of Robert De Niro Sr., the painter and father of the actor. She showed David Hare and Richard Pouzet d'Art. These were not established figures. These were the artists who would, collectively, become known as the abstract expressionists, the movement that shifted the center of gravity in the art world from Paris to New York and made American painting, for the first time in history, the dominant force in international contemporary art. And most of them received their first serious gallery exposure through Peggy Guggenheim, in a converted pair of tailor shops on the 7th floor of a midtown office building. The established art world of New York did not know what to make of her. She was not a scholar, she was not a trained curator. She was a woman with a botched nose job and a scandalous personal life, and a habit of saying exactly what she thought in situations that called for diplomacy. The critics who respected her work often condescended to her personally. The society figures who shared her last name were embarrassed by her. Her Uncle Solomon's Museum, which operated under the guidance of the formidable curator Hilaire Rebay, was philosophically opposed to surrealism, the movement Peggy championed most visibly. Rebay once wrote Peggy a letter telling her that her gallery was a disgrace to the Guggenheim name. The rejection stung. It always stung. No matter how much Peggy accomplished, there was always someone ready to remind her that she was the wrong kind of Guggenheim. And then there was the marriage. Max Ernst, the brilliant, cold, self-contained surrealist she had brought out of France, was pulling further away. He resented her money. He resented her need for attention. He resented, most of all, the growing sense that her gallery was becoming more important than his painting. In 1943, he met a young American artist named Dorothea Tanning, and the affair that followed was the end of the marriage in all but legal formality. They divorced in 1946. By 1914, Peggy was tired of New York, tired of the social warfare of the American art world, tired of being dismissed and mocked by people whose understanding of art was narrower than hers. She closed Art of this Century. She arranged for the American artists she had championed to be represented by the Betty Parsons Gallery, ensuring they would continue to have a place to show their work, and she packed up her collection once again and left. She was going to Venice, and she was not planning to come back. Peggy Guggenheim first visited Venice in 1940, when she was invited to exhibit her collection at the Venice Biennale, one of the oldest and most prestigious international art exhibitions in the world. Her works were shown in the Greek pavilion, which had been sitting empty, and the response was immediate. The European art world, which had not had a chance to see what Peggy had assembled during the war years, was confronted for the first time with the full scope of what she had done. The Cubists, the Surrealists, the Abstract Expressionists, the Brancusi, the Pollock, all of it in one place in Venice, shown by a woman most of them had dismissed or ignored. She fell in love with the city instantly. Venice was everything that New York was not. It was quiet, it was old. It moved at the pace of water rather than traffic, and it did not care, in the way that New York cared, about who you were supposed to be. In July 1949, she purchased Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, an unfinished 18th century building on the Grand Canal. The palazzo had been started in 1748 and never completed. Only the ground floor had been built. It was low and white and strange-looking, a truncated thing sitting among the grand palaces of the canal, like a sentence that someone had started and never finished. Peggy loved it for exactly that reason. It was, like her, something that did not fit the pattern. She moved her collection into the palazzo and, beginning in 1951, opened it to the public several afternoons a week during the spring, summer, and early autumn. There was no admission charge. There were no velvet ropes. Visitors walked through the rooms where Peggy actually lived, past the paintings she woke up to every morning, past the furniture she sat in, past the dogs that followed her everywhere. The boundary between the museum and the home did not exist because for Peggy there was no boundary. The art was her life. Her life was... They occupied the same rooms, literally and figuratively, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. She became, over the years, one of the most recognizable figures in Venice. She was the American woman with the butterfly sunglasses, designed for her by the artist Edward Melcarth, enormous winged frames that made her look like something between a socialite and an insect. She rode through the canals in her own private gondola, accompanied by her Lhasa Apso dogs, whom she called her babies and who accumulated over the decades until there were 14 of them. She entertained constantly. Artists, writers, collectors, and curious visitors passed through the palazzo in a steady stream. She was generous with her time and her hospitality and her willingness to talk about the art that surrounded her. But beneath the surface of this vivid public life, there was a loneliness that Peggy acknowledged openly, and that the people closest to her recognized as the defining condition of her later years. She had given everything to art. She had given her money, her time, her energy, her social life, her reputation. And what she had not given to art, she had given to men, a succession of lovers and husbands who had taken what she offered and left her, in most cases worse off than they found her. She admitted in interviews that she had always been looking for a man to replace her father, and that she had never found one. Her relationships with her 2 children were the part of the story that cost the most. Sindbad, her son, had grown up largely with his father, Lawrence Vale, after the divorce. He and Peggy were not close in the way that mothers and sons are supposed to be close. She once said she felt she had nothing in common with him beyond their physical resemblance. He rejected the art world entirely and built a life that had little to do with the one his mother had created. The distance between them was not dramatic or hostile. It was simply there, a gap that neither of them knew how to close. Pegeen was different. Pegeen was the child Peggy loved most fiercely and understood least. She was a painter, genuinely talented, working in a style that combined surrealism with a kind of naive directness that was entirely her own. But she had grown up in chaos. Shuttled between parents who fought viciously, raised in temporary homes across multiple countries, exposed to her mother's revolving door of lovers and to the particular instability that comes from being the child of someone whose emotional life is always in crisis. Mark Ernst, as Peggy's second husband and Pegeen's stepfather, had complicated things further. There were accounts of a closeness between Ernst and Pegeen that made people uncomfortable, and Ernst once painted a picture in which Pegeen appeared as an angelic figure and Peggy as a monster. The dynamics inside that household were not simple, and they left marks that did not heal. Pegeen married twice. Her first husband was the French painter Jean Hélion, with whom she had 3 sons. Her second was the English painter Ralph Rumney, with whom she had a 4th. Both marriages were turbulent. She struggled with alcohol, with prescription medication, with a depression that deepened over the years. She had attempted to end her own life multiple times. Her husband Rumney later said he had intervened on at least 17 occasions. On March 1, 1967, Pegeen died in her apartment in Paris. She was 41 years old. The cause was a combination of pills and alcohol. Whether it was intentional or accidental has never been settled with certainty. Peggy refused to believe it was suicide. She insisted for the rest of her life that her daughter would never have abandoned her 4 sons. She brought a legal action against Rumney, accusing him of murder and failure to assist a person in danger. The charges were eventually dropped. But the grief did not drop. It stayed. In her final years, Peggy said something that has stayed in the record because of how plainly it was spoken. Sindbad and Lawrence once told her, "You killed Pegeen," and sometimes she said, "I think I did." That is not a sentence that requires commentary. It stands on its own. After Pegeen's death, the palazzo grew quieter. The parties continued, but less frequently. The visitors still came, but Peggy was older now, slower, less interested in performing the role of the legendary Peggy Guggenheim for strangers. The dogs were her constant companions. The art surrounded her, the same paintings she had bought in Paris studios while bombs fell, the same sculptures she had smuggled across the Atlantic wrapped in bedsheets. They had outlasted every relationship she had ever had. They were, in a way she had perhaps not intended, the most reliable things in her life. She spent her last decades in the palazzo, walking through rooms full of masterpieces, riding her gondola on the Grand Canal, and living with the particular solitude of a woman who had given the world something extraordinary and received, in return, something considerably less than she had hoped for. In the 1970s, Peggy Guggenheim began to think seriously about what would happen to the collection after she was gone. She was in her 70s. Her health was declining. Her daughter was dead. Was living his own life, far from the art world she had built. The palazzo was full of masterpieces and empty of people, and Peggy understood with the clarity that comes to those who have outlived most of the things they loved, that the art would need a custodian. She had been courted for years by the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation, the institution her uncle Solomon had established in 1930 and that now operated the famous museum on Fifth Avenue in New York, the one designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, the one that bore the family name in enormous letters on its curved white facade. The same family that had looked at Peggy for decades as the embarrassing cousin, the black sheep, the one whose personal life was a source of perpetual discomfort and whose taste in art they had openly disdained. Hilary Bay, Solomon's curator, had once written to Peggy telling her that her gallery was a disgrace to the Guggenheim name, and now the foundation wanted what Peggy had built. There is something worth noting about that. The institution that had dismissed her was asking for her collection because the collection had turned out to be one of the most important in the world. And Peggy, who had spent her entire life proving that she belonged to a family that did not particularly want her, said yes. She donated the palazzo to the foundation in 1970. She donated the collection itself in 1970. The terms allowed her to live in the palazzo and to continue showing the art to the public for the remainder of her life, which is exactly what she did. She went on receiving visitors, walking through the rooms, sitting among the paintings, and riding her gondola on the Grand Canal with her dogs. On December 23, 1979, Peggy Guggenheim died in a hospital in Campo San Piero, near Venice. She was 81 years old. Her ashes were placed in a corner of the garden of the palazzo, next to the graves of her 14 Lhasa Apsos, the dogs she had called her beloved babies. The plaque is simple, the graves are small. If you visit the Peggy Guggenheim collection today, which is one of the most visited museums in all of Italy, you will find her there, in the garden, beside her dogs, a few steps from the Grand Canal, and a few rooms away from paintings that are collectively worth more money than she ever had in her life. And that is the secret that the title of this story promises. Not a hidden scandal, not a buried crime. The secret is the money. Peggy Guggenheim assembled the core of her collection during a 2-year window, roughly 1939 to 1940, in a Paris that was falling apart. She bought works by Picasso, Braque, Mondrian, Lega, Dali, Klee, Miro, Magritte, Brancusi, Giacometti, and dozens of others. She paid for the entire wartime buying spree, a total of approximately $40,000. A Mondrian for $160, a Magritte for $75, a Brancusi that she wept over and that the sculptor wept to part with. She bought these works because the artists needed the money, because the art was in danger, and because she had Reed's list and Duchamp's guidance and her own stubborn belief that what she was looking at mattered, even if the Louvre thought it was not worth saving and the Tate thought it was not art at all. By the time she donated the collection to the Guggenheim Foundation in 1976, it was valued at roughly $40 million. That alone represents one of the most extraordinary appreciations in the history of art collecting. But the real number, the one that makes the story almost impossible to believe, is what the collection is worth now. A single Pollock painting has sold at auction for nearly $200 million. Individual works by Picasso, Brancusi, Giacometti, and Mondrian have fetched tens of millions, and in some cases over 100 million each. The Peggy Guggenheim collection contains over 300 works by the most important artists of the 20th century, assembled at a moment when those artists were either unknown, undervalued, or desperate to sell. Conservative estimates place the current value of the collection well in excess of $3 billion. Some estimates go higher, $3 billion, assembled by a woman who was considered the poor Guggenheim. The one who inherited $2.5 million when her cousins inherited hundreds of millions. The one whose father went down with the Titanic and left his daughters on the wrong side of the family ledger. The one who could not get her nose fixed properly and who married men who hit her and who was told by her own family's institution that she was an embarrassment. She spent $40,000 on art that no one wanted, in a city that was about to be occupied, during a war that was destroying the civilization that had produced it. And that art turned out to be worth more than anything the Guggenheim mining empire ever pulled out of the ground in Colorado. That is the kind of irony that does not need to be underlined. You either see it or you do not. Peggy saw it. In her final years, she sat in her unfinished palazzo, surrounded by the work of people she had known personally, artists she had argued with and slept with, and supported and championed when no one else would, and she understood what she had done. She had not built a fortune. She had built something that made fortunes look small. The Peggy Guggenheim collection opened to the public permanently in 1980, the year after her death. It has not closed since. Visitors come by the hundreds of thousands every year, walking through the same rooms Peggy walked through, looking at the same paintings she looked at every morning when she woke up and every evening before she went to sleep. The collection is there on the Grand Canal in the unfinished palazzo, exactly where she left it. The dogs are buried in the garden. Peggy is buried beside them. And the art, which the Louvre would not protect and the Tate would not recognize and her own family could not understand, goes on being seen. She was the poor Guggenheim. She was the notorious one. She was the one they did not take seriously. And she left behind the most valuable cultural legacies any member of her family ever created. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the thing that remains when everything else has been forgotten. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.